The Holy Gospel according to Mark, beginning with the 2nd chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. One Sabbath day, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. Now they watched Jesus to see whether he would cure the man on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse Jesus. Jesus said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save a life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and it was restored. And the Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against Jesus, how to destroy him. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Lord Christ. Okay, show of hands. How many of you feel guilty when you just sit doing nothing? Okay? Now, how about if you're sitting and reading or watching TV? Do you still feel guilty? Okay, even if it's with your spouse or your children? Okay. We live in a society that values doing. Work. We talk about pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, getting what we have by the sweat of our brow. Our graduates from college and high school have all been hearing from speakers who tell them they can become whatever they want if they just work hard enough. We boast about how busy we are at work, how many hours we put in. Our value as people is associated with our productivity. My mother-in-law has said a number of times to me that she feels useless because there are things she just cannot do. So according to one 2016 study, half of U.S. workers give up at least some of their vacation time each year. Time off they've earned. At the end of 2017, it's the last year I could find statistics, one report found that an estimated 40% of U.S. employees regularly work more than 50 hours per week. 20% work more than 60 hours a week. Now, you want to know how badly you're afflicted by this? If you just said in your head, "Yeah, those guys are slackers," you've got it bad. Compared to 3 decades ago, when our parents were working, we now work 4 weeks more than we used to. Why do people do these things? Because we value the go-getters. These are the ones who get the raises, the promotions, who move up the ladder. Work has become our God, along with the demigod of money. These two go hand in glove, and we look to them to save us. I asked somebody at the Wednesday service if they knew the 4-letter word you did not want to be called in our society. He knew it right off the bat. It's the L word. Lazy. It's a pejorative. We sling at those who don't measure up to the gospel of doing, or even worse, don't worship at the altar. We sneer at these people, confident that their sin is that they are lazy. It's also historically and recently been used to describe those who do not measure up to the value of doing for yourself and your family. Those who receive SNAP or TANF government assistance with getting the basics of food, or sometimes direct assistance. If you can't make ends meet, if you're on the dole, then you must be lazy. Get a job. I work my butt off for what I get, and these people are living off my hard work and doing nothing. Now, we can probably name stories we've heard secondhand or even news reports that we saw that support this. Now, are there folks who game the system? You bet. That's the reality of the sinfulness we live in, and we should continue to work to root out that kind of abuse for the sake of those who need help. But let us keep the Eighth Commandment attitude that calls on us to look at what others do in the best possible light and look at the big picture before we form an opinion. In 2015, in the 1st and 2nd congressional districts in Iowa, where we live, of those who received SNAP, which is food assistance, only 15% of those households receiving assistance did not have at least one person working in the last 12 months, which means out of 100 people, 85 of those receiving SNAP had at least one person in the household who worked. This number gets even more impressive when you remember that those who receive SNAP, 2/3 of them are children, the elderly, and disabled. Most studies find that folks who can work and are on SNAP are those who've been working low-wage jobs which have a lot of turnover, and that they go on SNAP after they lose a job and as they're looking to find another. So the sin is not laziness. Their sin is that they cannot earn enough with their hard work to survive, to pay the rent, get shoes for the kids, help buy their elderly parents' medicine. Now, the problem of the Pharisees is not that they were bad people per se. It's just that they had bad theology. They'd forgotten that the Sabbath was made for humans, not vice versa. To them, the doing of the thing was more important than fulfilling the spirit of the thing. And this is what Jesus is trying to teach them. It is more important to save a life on the Sabbath, to do that service for another, even if it's not urgent. The man with the withered hand wasn't going to die. He could have waited until Monday. But it's more important to do that than it is to fulfill the letter of the law and not to work. What Jesus and the text from Deuteronomy remind us is that Sabbath is freedom. Freedom from your value being in what you do, where lazy is a curse word. Freedom from the idea that you are the one who provides, that without you and your work you will not eat, the world will not function, your doing is essential. Sabbath corrects us because it reminds us that it is not all about us and what we do. See, the concept of Sabbath is something unique to Judaism. Most religions declare people, places, things as holy, set apart, sacred. In the Sabbath, Jews claim that God has declared time as holy. And on the Sabbath, we try to become attuned to the holiness in that time. In the holy time of the Sabbath, the gods of doing and money who govern daily activity are set aside on the Sabbath. No superior could command an inferior to work. In fact, they had the responsibility to make sure they did not work. Did you notice that in our text? This hallowing of time is not just for the moneyed class who had leisure not to work, but it's also for the slave who had no say in their life. For the cook and the janitor, Sabbath is a means of making sure, at least in that moment, everyone can rest and recreate. When all participate in that rest, we are shown the reality that we are all one in God's eyes. But the Sabbath is not about rest as in leisure, although that can be a piece of being recreated. Rather, it is a reorienting to God and God's sovereignty. For it reminds us, even as manna and quail and water from the rocks reminded the Israelites in their wanderings in the wilderness, that all that we have comes from God and not our work. It reminds us that we are a people of resurrection, that we have been freed from all that destroys who we are, death. This idea that work will save us, and it raises us to be reunited with God and with our fellow believers. Here, the emphasis is That Sabbath is holy, set aside. Set aside so that we might have time to hear God's word, to receive God's grace in meal and font, to experience the reality that life can be different. That life fuller and more abundant that Jesus comes to give us is oriented to keeping the main thing, relationships with God and with fellow believers, with family and friends. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Now, the Sabbath is holy not by what we do on it, but because God has declared it so, yeah? But Martin Luther goes on to say that keeping Sabbath means taking time to assemble, to hear God's word, to share in the meal, to dip again into the waters of baptism. Listen to the promises those who are joining our assembly officially on this morning will make. The promises we have made or will make at our affirmation of baptism. Promises to hear God's word, share in the supper, to hang with a group of believers who are assembled. And the main time we do that is on Sunday, the day we observe as holy, set apart, made so by God's declaration and by the raising of His Son, Jesus Christ, from the dead. Now, I have to confess, one of the things that I have worked really hard in this sermon not to do is should us. You should do this, you should do that. For the worst mistake would be to turn Sabbath into law keeping. That's what the Pharisees were talking about. Sabbath is freedom. But I have to say, what breaks my heart is knowing what people are missing when they are not in this assembly. Not my sermons, surely. Well, maybe a little bit. But the joy of hearing the laughter and babble of children amongst us. Of receiving the witness of those who have seen it all and continue to walk with God. Yeah, Marv? The fellowship that comes from gathering with those who know our troubles, our triumphs, our joys, who have prayed with us through all of them, who have held our hand as we cry, who've laughed with us in joy, who receive through the word spoken and the meal, food for the journey, to grow our faith deep and strong. It is an imperfect means, yes, but it is the means by which God does this. See, I've seen when people with an immature faith have been hit by those storms we know will come, yeah? Sudden death of a mother, a diagnosis of cancer, a child of our own killed. I've seen that faith flattened. It's not destroyed, never will be, but it's decimated because the roots were not there. And I grieve what people miss. We need a Sabbath awakening. We need to be reminded again and again that the Sabbath is not just for our personal well-being, but for the abundant life of all. That Sabbath is taking intentional time that day to assemble with fellow believers in holy time. To hear maybe not your favorite music, to hear kids sing off key and babble, maybe a mediocre sermon, crumbly bread, sharp wine, but also to know that in those mundane things, God is at work. Freeing you in deed as well as in truth, shaping your heart so that you might see the man with the withered hand and work to restore him to wholeness and health. Sabbath is freedom. Freedom from and freedom for. We are freed by the gift of Sabbath from the gods of work and money, and we are freed from the tyranny of the schedule. We are freed from thinking we are the source of all things. We are freed from these things so that we might live for others. We are freed to lift that burden of doing from them, to see and acknowledge their worth as those who are created in the image of God, so that they too might open their eyes and receive the gift of Sabbath. Rest recreation in the arms of God who loved them in this way, that he sent his only born Son so that whoever looks upon him might be saved from a life of servitude to things that lead not to abundant life but small life. We are freed by the Sabbath to rest in God, so that we might go forth and bring the life and recreation we have found in God to the rest of the world. And that sounds to me an awful lot like good news. Amen.